Good morning. My name is Eden Thompson, and this past summer I interned with Surfrider Hawaii, where I researched in depth about plastic pollution at home. While volunteering at a marine debris art show, I came across a work by Dr. Katharine Owens that depicted a Hawaiian monk seal using marine plastic debris. I later found out that she worked at the University of Hartford, so I reached out to her. On behalf of the TAF Ecomods, I will introduce you. Dr. Katharine Owens is a National Geographic Explorer and Fulbright Nehru Fellow. She is an interdisciplinary scholar who merges science, policy, and the arts on the topic of plastic pollution. She has worked on plastic pollution projects worldwide. Katharine Owens is also professor and chair of the Department of Politics, Economics, and International Studies at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. In addition to National Geographic and the Fulbright Foundation, her work has been funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In 2021, she created Entangled and Ingested, a multi-year project to construct life-size portraits of animals harmed by plastic pollution by hand sewing film plastic on canvas. In her work, she seeks to continually push the boundaries between art and science, using the arts to explore some of the most pressing environmental problems of our age. Please welcome Dr. Owens.
Thank you so much, Eden. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you making this connection. Is this good? You guys can hear me? I'm going to start my timer so I'm not taking advantage of your time. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here and getting the chance to talk to you about my work. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself so you can kind of put it into context. My first college degree was in studio art, mainly painting and printmaking. And then I went on to do undergraduate degrees in biology and anthropology, and then a master's in environmental studies, and finally a PhD in governance and sustainability. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I feel like this interdisciplinary approach really is a hallmark of my work and makes it distinctive. And my work for the past 20 plus years has been about policy, environmental policy, more specifically water policy. And in the last decade or so, I've focused on plastic pollution. And you're a well-educated group of students. I'm sure you know about the issue of plastic pollution already. You might not know that in the 1950s, global markets were producing about 5 million tons of plastic each year. And now it's more often upward of 350 million tons every year. And when you read the publicly available materials that are online for people like me to find, from the plastics industry, they make it clear that they want this number to go up every year. That is their stated goal. And a lot of us recycle, and I think recycling is important. I recycle, for the record. But what we have learned about recycling is that it's, for the most part, more of a marketing tool than the actual design of materials to be reused again later. And so 95% of plastic packaging globally is not recycled, and 90.5% of all plastic ever made has never been recycled. So plastics are a really phenomenal material. I would challenge you to try to get through a day of your life without touching. I'm literally holding plastic right now. Like, our cars are made of plastic, our phones are made of plastic, our clothes are made of plastic. But because it's so useful, or some of the qualities that make it so useful can also make it a real problem in the environment. I'm going to talk about some of those challenges today. Plastics don't break down quickly. They harm wildlife, and that's sort of the heart of my Entangled and Ingested project. They worsen the issue of invasive species. They create a toxic soup in our oceans. They cost so much money to clean up, and they worsen the issue of climate change at every stage in their life. So first, plastics don't break down quickly. And actually, the truth is, we don't know how long it will take many plastics to break down. Think about the kind of plastics you encounter. Some are thin or thick, some are hard or soft. They all have different sort of breakdown times. But they are also affected by the environment that they're left to break down in. So if something's at the bottom of the ocean on a trench, it's going to break down much more slowly than a piece of plastic that's being exposed to sunlight, wind, oxygen, water, that kind of thing. So we really just don't even know. What we know is that these materials have been designed to be used for a moment, right, and then can take decades or a lifetime to break down. One of my friends who's a plastic pollution researcher likes to say that if Shakespeare had worn disposable diapers, those diapers would still be on the planet today, which is gross, right? Which also tells us, right, that every disposable diaper that's ever been used is still on the planet today, slowly, very slowly breaking down. The next couple of slides are going to have images of animals that have been harmed by plastic debris. If that's not something you want to look at, I want you to be aware that those slides are coming up. So the impact on wildlife mainly are focused on the issues of entanglement and ingestion. This is a photograph of a lace and albatross that's taken by the artist Christopher Jordan. And it's from the Midway Islands in the Pacific. They are relatively near the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, an area where plastic debris accumulates. So what happens, right, is the adult birds set up their nests, they go off to look for food, but more often than not, what they're finding is plastic material, and they're bringing that back to their young to feed them. And they can't evacuate that material from their stomachs one way or the other, and so instead it fills that space up, and there's not enough room in their stomachs to take in the calories that are needed to thrive and eventually fledge. And instead, I've seen documentaries about these nesting areas, and they are just littered with the carcasses of lace and albatross, who have never been able to live, to fledge. The other issue is of entanglement. This is a photo that was shared on a group I'm a part of by Helen Masters of the Phillip Island Nature Parks in Victoria, Australia, and it's of the Australian fur seal. She said when this animal was first brought into their clinic, they thought maybe it had been hit by the propeller of a boat because it has a sort of gash on its neck, shoulder. And then in trying to help the animal, actually what they found at the bottom of that wound was this piece of twine. I can't tell if it's like strapping from a shipping container package or if it's a string from a balloon, but because of the ruler, I can't tell, but it's relatively small and it looks lightweight. And yet, it caused injuries to this animal that it was not able to survive. They taxidermied the animal after trying to rescue it to use it as a teaching tool. A lot of what we know about entanglement and ingestion from plastic pollution comes from a book chapter that was written in 1997. And at that time, a researcher named David Laced simply gathered up all the records, many of them were anecdotal at the time, from different, publications in the literature. So someone would be studying turtles, someone would be studying sharks, and they would just sort of offhand mention they found this plastic in the stomach or this plastic wrapping around an animal. So he just listed all the species that were affected. So at that time, there were 267 species with records of either entanglement, ingestion, or both. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit later. Some other researchers, Stephanie Kuhn and her colleagues, did an update of this research in 2015, and they found by that time the number had more than doubled to 557. I think it's important to note two things are happening, right? Yes, there's more plastic in the ocean between 1997 and 2015, but this also became an issue that people study during that time, and so of course, if researchers are looking for it, they're going to find it more frequently. Plastic debris also worsens the issue of invasive species. So imagine how far a piece of driftwood can travel from one island chain to another, and then imagine how much farther a piece of plastic can go. And it's not that it has to be big dramatic pieces of plastic with mammals sort of hijacking their way from one island chain to another. Researchers are worried about microorganisms and bacteria that might be getting into new ecosystems because it's traveling on plastic long distances. A lot of people think that the Great Pacific Garbage Patch or these other gyres, one is larger than the state of Texas, are kind of floating islands of trash, but more accurately, they're like a churning soup of debris that is just breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces over time, upwards of trillions of pieces of debris. And I think it's really important to point out that plastic debris costs money. And those costs are not borne by the people who profit from selling single-use plastics. They're borne by governments, citizens. Millions of volunteer hours are used to pick up debris all over the world. Many of you have probably been involved in cleanups in your communities. So it's not just sort of an environmental issue, it's also a really important economic issue. And it's also true that plastic pollution worsens the issue of climate change every moment in its life, climate change. This is a photograph of the ethane cracker that's just gone online outside of Pittsburgh. It's a $6 billion project where they're turning fracked gas into single-use plastics. I know fracking was controversial when it was sort of like beginning to happen in Pennsylvania. And I don't remember in that debate sort of it being about using this for plastic. I think many of us could say, you know, if this is used to heat people's homes, right? If this is about people staying warm through the Pennsylvania winter, that's one thing. But framing it as really just being used directly for single-use plastics, I think changes the way we think about it and our priorities around that. But at every stage in its life, plastic is a problem for climate change. So this is the point when I always tell my students, I don't want you to lose hope. I don't want you to feel like this problem cannot be solved, because researchers believe this problem can be solved. And they believe that if we look at the root causes of the problem, if we think about how this problem can be different in different communities, if we consider how our own behavior impacts it, and if we use these tools to educate and to change policy, then we can make some headway. So having read all this literature, I decided in 2016 to apply for funding from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And what I wanted to do with this grant was just look at what this big global problem was like in Connecticut. I knew we weren't like these places in Hawaii where there's really dramatic debris, like hundreds of pounds, showing up on shorelines, but I wanted to know what it was like here. So the idea behind this grant is I would take my policy students, so these are not natural science students, these are social science students, and I would train them in really simple scientific methods, and we would go out and collect debris on Connecticut shorelines, and then analyze what we found, and then share the results with politicians, hoping that it might encourage them to consider this. So in a couple of cleanups on the Connecticut shoreline, we found just over 1,600 pieces of debris. It was overwhelmingly plastic, and it was what I would describe as municipal waste. So it wasn't from shipping or commercial or recreational fishing. It wasn't from manufacturing. It was the kind of things you all would recognize and that many of us use every day. It was plastic bottles and food wrappers, cigarette butts, which are the most frequently found item in cleanups globally and are made of plastic, and those kinds of things. So based on that project, I applied for funding to go live in India for 6 months with my family in Thiruvananthapuram in Kerala, which is in southwest India. It was an amazing experience, and the idea was that I would just replicate this project there. I would work with the students, teach them these very simple scientific methods. We would go out and collect and then share our results with policymakers. So one of our first cleanups was at Manamkila Beach, which is just near the University of Kerala, where I was stationed, for lack of a better word. And in our cleanup, we found just over 6,000 pieces of debris. Just like in the United States, it was overwhelmingly plastic. And just like in Connecticut, it was what I would call municipal waste. We were seeing the same things: food wrappers, plastic bags, flip-flops, children's toys, toothbrushes, that kind of thing. So working with a colleague in Kerala, I applied for funding from the National Geographic Society. And what we wanted to do with that grant was, while I was still in Kerala, invite researchers and people who worked in NGOs, teachers, down to Kerala to learn the methods we were using, and then ideally go back to their home communities and replicate the project. So this is a group of 33 folks who came from around Kerala to be a part of this week-long workshop sponsored by National Geographic. And for one of our cleanups, we went to a nearby river, the Kalamana River, where we found over 1,600 pieces of debris. The story is the same. Most of it was plastic. All of it would be described as municipal waste. And then we went back to Manamquillan Beach, where just a few months after finding 6,000 pieces, we found another 6,000 pieces of debris. Again, overwhelmingly plastic and described or characterized as municipal waste. So some of these folks, about 10 of the 33, were able to go back to their home communities and replicate the project, which was really cool. And that led to cleaning up an additional 33,000 pieces of debris. Plastic was always the most frequently found item, though it ranged in the samples from 45 to 89% of the total sample. So it's a really great project, felt really good about it. At this point, having gotten funding from the National Geographic Society, I was a National Geographic explorer. And they encouraged us to work with other explorers to apply for funding to extend our projects. So I worked with 2 other explorers, Hannington Ochieng, river ecologist from Uganda, and Puspita Kamil, social scientist from Indonesia. And we applied for a grant to replicate this project on the Aturukuku River in Tororo, Uganda. Rivers are kind of seen as, sadly, like the growth area for this kind of research, because rivers lead to the sea, communities are often by rivers, and that's sort of like the path that plastic takes. So this is now the end of 2019, we apply for this funding and we get this grant. And we're planning in the summer of 2020 to spend a couple of weeks in Uganda replicating this project. So at this point, I've come back from India with my family. We've had this amazing experience living in another place for 6 months. And I really feel that my work is culminating in these cool ways. At the end of 2019, I'm creating a class with a colleague on plastic pollution at my university. I have a workshop planned in Colombia and South America. I'm planning to return to India to work on a project for National Geographic. And I really thought that 2020 was going to be my year. And you probably know what happens next, right? 2020 was not my year. And I would argue that it was nobody's year, right? All of that got canceled. All of those projects got canceled, just ripped out from under our feet. And in addition, the role I was serving at the University of Hartford was an partially administrative role. So I led a department with about 75 faculty members reporting to me. So everything about my job changed. I'm all of a sudden not getting to do this research that I love, and instead of doing much more of this very difficult work of trying to get almost 100 faculty members teaching online and strange circumstances. So through this depression, and I'm being serious, it was a very difficult period where I felt heartsick about these changes. I started thinking about the story we tell about plastic pollution. The reason I went to India in the first place is because it's sort of put on as this, in the literature, as this sort of hotspot for plastic pollution. And when you read the literature, the scientific literature, it's not uncommon to see things like, these are the 10 worst polluting countries in the world. These are the 10 dirtiest rivers in the world. And inevitably, they're talking about places in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And I feel that this is a very colonial view of this problem in many ways. I have very limited experience in South Asia, really only 6 months of my life. But during that time, I could see that the people around me live just like we do in Connecticut for the most part. The grocery stores have the same kind of items on the shelves, right? The difference is in Connecticut, when I have my plastic debris, right, I try not to buy things wrapped in plastic. I don't know if you've been to a grocery store lately. It's very difficult to get out of there without things wrapped in plastic. I can take my canvas bag in there, but so much of our food is wrapped in plastic. When I have that waste and I throw it away, what happens is that a truck picks it up and it disappears, and I never have to think about it again. And that's not what happens in India, right? But to my mind, we have not solved that problem at all here in the United States. It's more that we're better at hiding that problem. Because what happens to our waste? It is, at best, going to be landfilled or incinerated, both of which have huge environmental consequences. And then if it doesn't make it through one of those tracks, it ends up on a beach or a river where people like me pick it up. So I thought, how could I tell a more honest story about the relationship that people like me have with plastic that's not about sort of pointing at someone else very far away, but talks about my own experience. So I have this background in the arts, and I believe the arts are a really important way to tell stories, and that they can connect with people in ways that my scientific articles are never going to connect with people. And so I started thinking about that and sort of how I might integrate the arts into my work. And I thought about that book chapter from 1997 by David Laced. If you recall, there were 267 species that he identified at that time, for which there were records of entanglement, ingestion, or both. And I thought 267 seems like a lot. I might not be ready to dive into that right now, but of those, these are the 46 species at that time where there were both records of entanglement and ingestion. So over 20 years ago, we knew that these animals were suffering from both entanglement and ingestion from plastic pollution. So I thought there's an argument to be made there that they're more at risk, and so I'll focus on them. And I had been experimenting, this sounds crazy out loud, but I'd been experimenting with sewing film plastic onto canvas. I had all this plastic and I couldn't figure out how to recycle it. Because even if it's stamped with those chasing arrows, it doesn't mean that it can be recycled. And no film plastic can be recycled curbside anywhere in the United States. So that's much more about marketing than about reality. So I'd been experimenting with sewing this plastic, and I thought, well, I'd like to make these portraits of these animals, and I'd like to make them life-size, because I'm very much a visual learner. And some of them are cute, little penguins and puffins, and some of them are very large whales. And I thought, why not, right? It could be fun. So I started creating these portraits. My process is very simple. I just take a piece of canvas and I sketch the animal really loosely onto the canvas. You can see really quick sketches. And then I start hand sewing the plastic onto the canvas to create the portraits. And I've completed the first 50 or so. I'm just going to go through these slides and show them to you rather quickly. You'll see the dimensions at the bottom, so you can track how big they're getting. That's the Laced albatross. That's that sort of poster species for the issue of ingestion from the Midway Islands. That's a great white shark made exclusively of Amazon packaging. So at this point, we're about in the summer of 2021, and things are starting to open up again after the pandemic, and I'm getting ready to start doing the whales. And I thought it's a lot more fun and interesting for me if I make it a public art project. So I started reaching out to kids camps in Hartford, West Hartford, and Middletown. Those are the towns where I sort of live and work. This is at the Free Center in Hartford. And I started taking the minke whale, the first of those whales, the smallest whale on this list, out to have the public help me work on it. That's the minke whale, all finished, 18 feet. by 7 feet. And then we started on the sperm whale, which is the state whale, or maybe it's the state animal in Connecticut. It happens to be one of the animals on my list. This is at an elementary school in Middletown. They're having like a pajama day. They don't all wear pajamas every day to school. It's like a special day. And then in Middletown where I live, they allowed me to use an empty storefront, a former Woolworths store, to have this sort of open sewing session. So for about 6 months, when I wasn't at work, I was there having open sessions where the community could come in and work on it, and where I could go and work on it. These are each 60-foot long strips that are about 6 feet tall. You can kind of see it taking shape there. And that's it finished. That's me next to it for scale. The final sperm whale is 60 feet by 20 feet. We hung it at the University of Hartford for about 6 months, which is kind of cool because with the light behind it, I think it looks totally different, more like a stained glass kind of thing. And now it got put up at the Bradley Airport in December. It should be up until June. This is the crew hanging it there, the crew that helped me hang it. And then the other large whale from this first series is the bowhead whale, and I had a couple of workshops at schools where people were helping me. This is at the American Mural Project. I don't know if you're familiar with that in Winston, Connecticut. They were helping me work on it. And there you can see the bowhead whale finished. There I am on the side for scale again. So I finished that first series of 46, and now I'm working on the second series of 73. I feel like I kind of have my work cut out for me for the next 5 years or so. Here are some of the ones. I've tried different things because I don't have that large open studio space any longer for this. I cut it up into small panels and sort of sewed them together at the end, almost like a quilt. You can see with the background, I'm even kind of leaning into that idea of a quilt with the diagonal lines in the back. But that was sewn with members of the public. This was also done in small pieces. This is the pygmy right whale. It's being shown here at the Durham Fair in Connecticut this last fall. It's 24 feet wide. And then I've done several, I've been invited on several trips by the Virgin Corporation to lead workshops on their ships. And so I've had several small projects where I worked with them over a couple of weeks. This was done with a group of middle schoolers in Middletown. They were very reluctant. And this is done with elementary school kids in Middletown. Each elementary school did one of sort of the stripes of the rainbow. I had day-long workshops with them to create this 24-foot long orca portrait. That project in Uganda still hasn't happened. We're still trying to collaborate together, Hannington and I. But what we eventually did with that project was we each did research in our own home communities and then compared the results for a subsequent publication. And in my own work, I am still doing that kind of research where we do collections, but I'm much more interested in how we use art to explore science. And I'm trying to, in my own work, kind of push the envelope with that. And there are researchers who believe you can use art to collect scientific data, and I'm trying to understand what that means for my own work. And as a part of that, I was invited on a voyage by Lindblad and National Geographic to circumnavigate Svalbard in the Arctic this past summer. And my proposal was that I would go on this trip and I would create a sketchbook of watercolors the whole time, especially looking at issues of climate change and plastic pollution. So these are some of the watercolors that I produced as a part of that project. I was also talking to people in the crew and learning about the area and incorporating that into the sketchbook I created. Svalbard is a place where there are more polar bears than people, and yet we would go to a beach where no one lived for hundreds of miles, and we would find plastic on that beach. We couldn't collect it all because once it comes on the ship has to deal with it, and they weren't prepared to do that. We tried to collect some of it. But here I'll quickly share some of the sketches and watercolors I produced as a part of that trip. We circumnavigated Svalbard. This was in June, and because of climate change, we were able to do that. Normally, you wouldn't be able to get all the way around the group of islands. because of the ice coverage. And it was this trip that was all marketed as being about seeing polar bears. So we saw a lot of polar bears on the trip. We would see them interacting with plastic regularly. Some beautiful landscapes, but it was a bit of a mixed bag because, of course, I'm there to learn about the environment, and the fact that I'm there is harmful to the environment, I believe. So it was complicated, but it was an amazing opportunity. I was glad to get the chance. And I'm still trying to figure out how I will use this to tell a scientific story, and that's just part of the work I'm doing right now. That's the Global Seed Bank, which is in Longyearbyen, which is on Svalbard. Yeah, so that's the icebreaker that we were on. So I'm sure that you all know kind of the things that you can do to make the problem of plastic pollution better. But I wanted to share just a few, about reducing and reusing and recycling. Some people believe it should be refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, so we can try to eliminate waste or lower the amount of waste. So much of the work I do is around food packaging, and so I think using the CSA or farmers markets can help with that. In Middletown, we have refill stores where you can take things and get laundry detergent, dishwashing soap, that kind of thing, which is kind of new for Middletown, and I think a really neat thing. I think it's important to talk to policymakers at every level. There has been a policy on the books the last few years in Congress, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, but it hasn't really gone anywhere. It's not people's top issue right now, and I understand that. But I also try to do things like, I think in our society, communicating with the people that sell things can be as useful at times as communicating with politicians or leaders. So I don't like to shame people on social media, but I do like to amplify people who are doing good work, and so I try to post about companies or products that I think are doing the right thing in terms of their plastic packaging in particular. There are also apps like the Marine Debris Tracker app, which was created by a National Geographic explorer, and the Clean Swell app, which anyone can use to collect litter, and it tags it, geotags it, so that researchers around the world can understand and track the debris and the pollution in your part of the world. So I recommend those if you want to try to work towards solving this problem. These are some of the institutions that have supported my work, and I want to thank you for your time and attention.